This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hello, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, and this marks our 100th episode, a nice milestone. We wanted to take a moment to thank you, the listeners, viewers, subscribers. We greatly appreciate your engagement and look forward to more of your interesting questions and observations. We also wanted to mention that we're grateful for all of your questions, but unfortunately, for practical reasons, we can only answer a small percentage of them, which generates some very tough choices. But amid that, please know that we do read and think about all of them and try to incorporate as many overlapping themes as possible. All right, so in honor of this milestone, we thought we'd change things up a bit this episode.
And thus, for our first question, we have Liuba from Canada who says, "Dear Offspring, working with your father in this unique way makes me think that you might have suggested this podcast concept to him. What inspired it, and what do you enjoy most about it?"
First, thank you, Liuba, for your question. In terms of how my idea for this podcast came to be, well, a few years ago, my father was getting a really large number of emails asking him science questions, which he always tried to answer, but there were a lot of them, and he was finding it overwhelming. And after his book Determined was published in 2023, this intensified even more, and it became clear to me that he needed sort of a broader forum to address these. This was, of course, kind of concurrent with the internet really taking off, podcasts in particular, and making things like science more accessible. And we wanted to create a venue where he could delve into topics in more detail, field broader overlapping subjects of interest, and reach a larger number of people simultaneously. So yeah, we got this podcast up and running. A funny facet of this endeavor has been the fact that he is not particularly tech-oriented, perhaps arguably even a bit tech-phobic. I have a theater and media background, so the tech end of it was more natural for me, and I really enjoy running all the behind-the-scenes components of filming, video editing, online management, interfacing with YouTube and Spotify, keeping the professor on schedule. In terms of your question about what I enjoy most about doing this, in addition to the nuts and bolts tech end, it sits perfectly at the intersection of two interests of mine. I obviously grew up immersed in this science from both my parents, and I did a psych minor in college along with a theater dance media degree. And so this is a great way of combining both of these areas. And on a more sentimental note, since at the moment we live on opposite coasts, this is really just a great excuse for a fun joint family venture. My brother Benjamin has made a couple of cameos, and my mother, who has a background also in both neuropsychology and theater, has a lot of input in getting this out each week, including basically running the tech end on the West Coast, not to mention spotting if his clothes are clashing. So yeah, it's great having this as a regular collaborative venture. And now on to our next question. Sam from Toronto asks, what are some key differences between SSRIs and SNRIs?
This is a surprisingly trendy question. SSRIs, drugs that are among the most often used, the most efficacious against depression. Brief overview. So you've got neurons, one talking to another, and the standard picture is the first neuron, when it has something to say, releases a chemical messenger, which goes and binds to receptors on the second neuron and excites it, passes on the message. So the released messenger is called a neurotransmitter, and there's scads of them, and some of the most common, well-known, are serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. SSRIs target serotonin, and they have something to do with the housekeeping that goes on in a synapse, the space between two neurons. So the first neuron on this side, the presynaptic side, releases neurotransmitter, which goes floating across and binds to receptors on the postsynaptic side and causes excitation there, and the message is passed on. After that, the neurotransmitters float off. And at that point, you want to terminate the signal. Neurons do it one of two ways. One is you degrade the neurotransmitter in the synapse, you flush out the breakdown products, the signal is over with. Alternatively, there can be a pump, a reuptake pump in the presynaptic neuron that takes the serotonin that just did its job at the receptors and takes it back up and recycles it for subsequent use. So the serotonin system is very heavily dependent on this reuptake. And what SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. What's the logic there? You throw in a drug which blocks the reuptake, the removal of serotonin from the synapse, the recycling of it. You don't remove it, and thus it sticks around longer in the synapse. And thus it hits the receptor a second time and a third time and 100th time. You amplify the signal. Now, what people first started figuring out 80s, 90s was that you give somebody with major depression an SSRI, and often they would get better. One of the most effective antidepressants out there. So you look at this, you give someone a drug that causes serotonin to stick around in the synapse longer and amplifies its signaling more, and people start feeling better. What's the obvious hypothesis? Ooh, depression involves too little serotonin being released. So that is the serotonin hypothesis. It comes with a bunch of uh-ohs. The first one, you throw in an SSRI like Prozac, you throw it in, and within hours, it's blocking the reuptake of serotonin. Great. The person typically doesn't start feeling better for days to weeks. There's some sort of time lag, a dissociation, and incredibly complicated models out there to try to explain what that's about. Second uh-oh, is what I would refer to as the serotonin wars, which has been a hugely contentious issue for a couple of decades now as to what SSRIs actually do and whether there's anything wrong with serotonin and depression. And there's a whole separate story to be gone into with that. But the main punchline there is a number of critics have pointed out that there's actually not great evidence that there is suppressed serotonin levels in the brain in depression. So maybe serotonin has nothing to do with it. And the responses to that are twofold, and I endorse both of those responses. The first one is the techniques that have been used to try to determine whether a depressed individual has lower levels of serotonin in their synapses are really, really indirect. And you can't conclude a whole lot from them. And very recent studies have worked out the techniques to actually measure serotonin in a living person's brain. And what those studies are suggesting is that, yes, indeed, there are lower levels of serotonin. The second thing that people come back with when faced with this criticism, oh, the serotonin hypothesis is nonsense. The chemical hypothesis is nonsense. It has nothing to do with depression. The second response is for someone to say, that's interesting. So you have a headache and you take some ibuprofen. Does that mean your brain has a shortage of ibuprofen? No, obviously not. The fact that ibuprofen can mitigate the unpleasantness of a headache doesn't mean there's a shortage of that stuff in your brain. And even if it turned out that there's not a shortage of serotonin in the brain of people with major depression, the fact that boosting up the serotonin signaling with an SSRI, the fact that that helps in no way compromises the therapeutic efficacy of the stuff. Okay, so I'm a big fan of serotonin is still involved. The best evidence suggests a shortage of, but that's not a slam dunk. And SSRI sure work. The third uh-oh came in with the recognition that the famed first S of SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, these drugs only block the reuptake of serotonin, turned out to be a little bit inaccurate, and there's less specificity than people used to think, and there's some degree of blocking reuptake of the neurotransmitter norepinephrine in other parts of the brain. Okay, so at that point, the field has made lemonade out of lemons and said, okay, well, we see you block serotonin reuptake a whole lot, and you block a little bit of norepinephrine reuptake with these SSRIs, and people feel better. Maybe let's try focusing in on the norepinephrine reuptake aspects, and thus the introduction of SNRIs, serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, retooling them so that they will be more effective at the norepinephrine reuptake pumps as well as with the serotonin reuptake pump. And so in recent years, the SNRIs have become fairly trendy. Best known ones are probably Fexor and Cymbalta, and they're being used increasing amounts. Do they work well? In many cases, yes. Do they absolutely work better than, say, pure SSRIs or any of a whole other menagerie of antidepressants? No, because depression itself is very heterogeneous. The field forever has tried to figure out if you could sit down with someone who's depressed and ask them a bunch of questions and hang out with them for half an hour and say, aha, this is the antidepressant of the 20 or so available. This is the one that we should start them off with at this dose. That's the one that's going to work best. It's not that clear, and dosing among the numerous available antidepressants with the various dosing regimes available has to be individualized, personalized, usually by trial and error. So within the range of tackling neurotransmitter problems with depression, boosting up serotonin signaling with SSRIs. Oh, yeah, boosting up a little bit of norepinephrine also, or intentionally boosting up both serotonin and norepinephrine signalings. Both of these are pathways towards helping people with depression.
Okay, now Naeed asks, have you ever touched a gorilla?
Yes, twice. And I love gorillas. All right. There's this naturalist named George Schaller who's like the naturalist's naturalist. He's in his 90s now. He's done incredible field work with like half the species out there on Earth. And in the late 1950s, before Jane Goodall, before Dion Fossey, before Baruti Galdikas, there was George Schaller and doing the very first field work observing mountain gorillas. And no one had ever done that before. And he wound up publishing a book about his year of research there called The Year of the Gorilla, which I read when I was a kid. And that's when I decided I was going to grow up and be a primatologist, and especially one studying mountain gorillas. And, everybody can't grow up to study mountain gorillas, circumstances, what scientific questions I was interested in. It didn't make sense to actually study mountain gorillas. It was totally impractical. Baboons wound up making more sense. I dealt with the disappointment, but I still love gorillas. And yes, I've gotten to touch a gorilla twice. The first one was when I was in high school, and I was working as an intern at the American Museum of Natural History in their primate hall. And the primatologist, anthropologist guy who was supervising me knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who took care of the gorillas at the Bronx Zoo. So we went up to the Bronx Zoo and we got to go in the back, and this big silverback male came in, and through the bars of his cage, he reached out and we touched fingers. It felt like it was like in the Sistine Chapel, the creation of Adam, that I was being. Actually, it felt much more like when Elliot cuts his finger and E.T. says, ouch, and fixes. This gorilla touching my fingertip just made the pain go away of just having taken the subway all the way from Brooklyn. So that was a totally magical moment for me. A second time I've touched a gorilla, which was around 2015 in the Cincinnati Zoo, where just by good fortune being able to go back behind the scenes, and there was this big silverback male who had been trained to come up to the bar. So if it was needed to take a blood sample from him to give him an injection, very well trained with that. And he came up and then he reached out and we got to touch fingers again and the same magic all over again. Postscript. Some of you who are real gorilla history trivia buffs will have guessed by now that that gorilla was Harambe, the gorilla who a year later or so, 3-year-old boy climbed over a fence and fell into the enclosure, and Harambe had the kid, and people will debate forever, was he being aggressive to the kid? Was he being protective and aggressive to all the people screaming all around and such? But in one of those, please may I never have to be making a decision like this, it was decided he had to be killed. Harambe was shot in the head by one of his keepers who was devastated by this. Why didn't they dart him, anesthetize him? Because it would have taken him minutes to go down, and the darting would have agitated him even more than he was. This is what was done. And heart, mind, in terms of assessing it, that was a very tough call, and almost certainly through no fault of Harambe, that saved the kid's life. So that was Harambe, my second gorilla.
Continuing on the ape theme, Pine from Taiwan says, I have been absolutely obsessed over Gibbons recently. Is there anything about Gibbons that you would like to talk about?
As well, you should be, Pine, along with the rest of us. Gibbons, the often forgotten ape. There are the great apes, us, chimps, gorillas, orangutans, and then Southeast Asia, gibbons are called lesser apes, and they're often overlooked. And of course, they're wildly endangered, just like all the other apes. Cool things about gibbons, they are the only ape that pair bonds, that forms monogamous relationships, pair bond for life. And we all say yay and good American values with the gibbons, which is puzzling because at the same time, we're also often obsessed with bonobos for their like polyamorous pansexuality sort of stuff, which is very different. That was a pun, by the way. Pan is the Latin term for the genus that includes both chimps and bonobos. Anyway, what is there interesting to say about Gibbons beyond all of that interesting stuff already? Best thing that makes my heart sing is they sing. They sing. This is not like some cheap circus trick bird song. And I just imagine the hate mail I'm going to get now for having said that. They sing. They sing to an extraordinary extent. Okay, they're not the only animals that sing. Humpback whales, we've known for decades about that humpback whale songs, but they're like so lugubrious because the humpback whales are just weighed down by time and sadness with human folly and all that water pressing down on them. Gibbons, on the other hand, are optimistic and upbeat when they're singing. Let's listen to an example of this. Can you believe how beautiful that is? Dulcet tones, soothing, optimistic. Every single morning, a gibbon wakes up and sings that today is the first day of the rest of its life. They also sing in choruses. So let's listen to a sample of that one. They're the best. And thus you should obsess over them and listen to their singing. Forget opera, forget Gregorian chants, forget Fergie singing the national anthem, go listen to all the Gibbons singing that you could find on YouTube. It's wonderful.
Wrapping up today, Bilal from Pakistan asks, historically, why do some humans have an interest in the occult, esoteric, and black magic-like practices? Does it sit as mental disorders, personality, or just a trait?
We are going to tread oh so carefully here because of any number of landmines that are lurking in this topic. First one, the very challenging task of differentiating between normative human experience and psychiatrically suspect, and what one sees is tremendous context dependency. There's many settings in which hearing voices could get you a psychosis diagnosis. There's other settings where hearing voices occurs in a highly religious context, and where in those settings, not only is hearing voices, talking in tongues, wildly ornate ritualism that would get you an obsessive compulsive disorder label, in a more secular setting, not only does religion make room for that, but it sanctions it, and it protects the people who would be stigmatized otherwise because of some of these neuropsychiatric abnormalities. Okay, so getting that out of the way, to make sense of an interest in the occult, we have to deal with a basic human predicament, which is we spend a lot of our most intense moments trying to explicate the inexplicable, trying to explain things that are unexplainable, the massive monumental things that surround us that are mysterious. And what we have as humans is a huge need for attribution, a huge need to explain why something is. What's the purpose of life? What happens after we die? Where are our loved ones after they leave us? What did we think when we were fetuses? Do we have a soul? All those sorts of things. We have a real attraction as humans for dealing with the ineffable, and what motivates us, what drives us, this engine of wanting attribution, wanting explanation. And that sure becomes relevant here. Let me step into a second landmine, which I very, very, very tentatively am going to put belief in things like the occult, the paranormal, and many aspects of religiosity under the same umbrella. Send in the complaining emails now at this point. For this purpose, just grouping all of them because they have some important things in common. First off, is they all depend on you believing in something which cannot be proven, faith. And where, in fact, in many religious and occult traditions, you get power from having faith in the unprovable. Who cares about believing in something that's proved to exist? The strength of faith and belief is the fact that it is unprovable. Now, more pertinent to this issue, what religious belief, occult belief, paranormal belief is very often about is what we might call probabilistic distortions, or to get even more arcane, what we might call aberrant autocorrelation perception. What am I talking about? You flip coins, somebody's flipping coins 100 times or so, and out of nowhere, there's 11 tails in a row. And we as a species in our search for attribution are very vulnerable to seeing autocorrelations there, that there is some sort of connection in that string of 11 tails in a row, somehow having done 5 tails in a row increased the probability of the next one being tails, and the next one after that, of all of us seeing this aberrant sense of connectiveness in events that are random. And an awful lot of religious belief is about seeing autocorrelations where there are not. Perceptions that random events, in fact, are not random. Now, that said, humans are lousy at dealing with randomness. We have a great deal of difficulty in perceiving randomness for what it is. We see patterns in it instead. we have tremendous difficulty in actually generating random sequences of numbers, random things of any sort. Humans have a lot of trouble dealing with randomness, such that, this afternoon you set up an altar and you sacrifice a goat on it and you slather its intestines all over it. And tonight a stranger gives you a brand new Chevy Suburban. We are very, very predisposed towards deciding there was some sort of connection between those two events. In some way, they were correlated. In some way, there was some sort of causality, the first event making the second one more likely. Now, what's particularly interesting is we become more vulnerable to seeing autocorrelations, causality that is not there when we are stressed. When we are tired, you take people and you stress them in any number of ways, and they will see more patterns, perceived patterns, in random dots of things than they would otherwise. You take people who you stress experimentally, and on the average, they are more likely to say they are religious. Stress, uncertainty, ambiguity, all of that pushes us in the direction of looking really desperately for attribution that may not necessarily be there. So this seems to be a very human trait. Turns out, though, one of the all-time great psychology studies showed this is not just a human state. And this was a famous study done in 1948 by B.F. Skinner, godfather of behaviorism, one of the giants of 20th century psychology, who demonstrated an interesting phenomenon in pigeons. For very arcane reasons, he mostly studied pigeons. And what he showed was you take a pigeon who's really hungry, you put the pigeon in the cage, and suddenly, from out of nowhere, you drop a pellet of food in there, something that pigeon loves, and it's hungry. And what does the pigeon do? Saying, "Whoa, where'd that come from? Whoa, what just caused that food pellet to be dropped into my cage? I know whatever I was doing right before that food pellet appeared." And the pigeon assumes an autocorrelation, causality between whatever it is. Wait, what was I doing? I know I was standing on one leg and my right wing, I would just happen to be doing it. That's the thing that caused the food to suddenly. And the pigeon does it again. No food. Let's try it again. Let's try it even more extreme and really Look, another pellet of food appears. That proves it. This is what causes the food to be delivered if I do it sincerely enough and emphatically enough and perfectly enough. And what Skinner would see in about 75% of pigeons, you would condition some totally random stereotypical behavior that the pigeon now believed, as it did it over and over and over again, that with a high probability, better than chance, this was the thing that caused the food to be delivered. And Skinner really stepped into it in what he termed this, beginning with the title of the behavior, superstitious behavior in pigeons, setting animals up that in circumstances of great need, stress, hunger, whatever, when something inexplicable and consequential suddenly happens, what we see is even pigeons like us are looking for attribution. So we see some of the building blocks of people's belief in the occult, people's belief in paranormal experiences, in some of the more unorthodox outposts of religiosity, fundamentalist perhaps. And we come back to Bilal's question, where are individual differences coming from with this? Why are some people more prone towards making these associations than others? And there was a wonderful paper in Science in 1979. Davenport was the first author showing something fascinating. Now you're taking lab rats and you show they are subject to the same superstitious behavior. You get a very hungry rat and you suddenly deliver a food pellet, and that rat is saying, "What did I do just now? What did I do just now to cause that to happen?" It is looking for attribution. Dump food in there randomly a few more times when it happens to be doing that stereotypical behavior, and you've conditioned superstitious behavior in this rat. Same deal as with the pigeons. And what was shown in this study was if you damage the hippocampus in these lab rats, they become more vulnerable to superstitious conditioning. It takes less yoking of the two events. The rat now standing on its tail and whistling Yankee Doodle or something. Oh, that's obviously that causes the food to be delivered. It takes less yoking in a rat with hippocampal damage to decide they are seeing significant predictability, attribution, autocorrelation, causal relationships there. It's easier to condition this superstitious behavior when you damage a rat's hippocampus. Because what the hippocampus is really good at is very literal, journalistic, sequential, logical ordering of events there and making sense of this. And if you have a hippocampus that's been damaged, you have a rat that becomes much more prone towards deciding there is a causal relationship there when it is not. You look at humans with certain types of hippocampal damage and certain subtypes of temporal lobe epilepsy that is extreme and treatment resistant and a whole lot of cumulative seizures. You get hippocampal damage, you see increased susceptibility to superstitious conditioning. Now, when you look at people and you use any of these scales for how prone this person is towards believing in paranormal experience, what you see is, on the average, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex work a bit differently than in other people. There's less executive frontal control over what the hippocampus concludes the world is about. What are we looking at here? Individual differences in how tightly you demand a correlation between cause and effect, how loose that relationship has to be before you decide there's some causality there that most other people would not. And that is episode 100. Robert Sapolsky.
I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.
Yes, very much appreciated.